You're listening to the Breakaway Wealth Podcast, the show that helps you build wealth faster, think outside the box, and break out of the herd. Here's your host, Jim Oliver.
Welcome back, Breakaway Wealth. I'm your host, Jim Oliver, and with me today, our friend Jimmy Song. Welcome, Jimmy.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. It's a good time to be here.
Absolutely. Everybody that's been listening, Jimmy's been on the show before, and he has an incredible book that if you haven't read, you need to read it. There's actually one chapter, and we got a new book too, but Thank God for Bitcoin is a great book. And I got to tell you, Jimmy, there's one part of it where you talk about if we're exchanging time for money, and the government's debasing that, then they're basically stealing our lives, and that's the definition of slavery. I got to tell you, I say that, I copy, model, honor you with that all the time because it's so true. And the way that you said it was way more eloquently than I could say it. But Jimmy, for people that haven't listened to you before on the show or somebody else's show, or maybe they're not even into Bitcoin or anything, give us a little bit of who Jimmy Song is, and I love your story, so go ahead, take as much time as you want.
Okay, yeah, I'm a coder by trade. I've been programming since I was 9 years old, and I got into Bitcoin back in 2011, and I've been programming in it, teaching in it, working in it ever since. So I come from a technical background, and that's how I got into Bitcoin. Since then, obviously, I've learned a lot more about economics and even like how it relates to morality and Christianity and natural law and things like that. So, I'm a Bitcoin expert. I've taught classes on Bitcoin. I've been an expert witness in court cases. I've done a lot of stuff around Bitcoin, so I know about it, almost every aspect of it, and I've studied it for a long time. Yeah, that's who I am, and I've written a bunch of books, including Thank God for Bitcoin. The newest one is Fiat Ruins Everything, and yeah, I've written 5 books on Bitcoin, one very technical, 3 that are, I guess, a little bit more geared towards non-Bitcoin audiences, and this newest one, which is geared towards a Bitcoin audience.
So, Jimmy, a couple things I want to touch on because one, I want to talk about the fiat system. I want to talk about your new book, just some of the messages in that book. And then obviously we'll put a link on how people can get the book, and the names of all of your books. We'll put them in the show notes. Because if you're a technical guy like our friend Bob Burnett, then maybe he hasn't read your technical book. I'm going to bet that he has, though. And then if you're just somebody that's like, gosh, should I own Bitcoin? I don't have any Bitcoin. Or is Bitcoin dead? Or what happens if this election goes this way or that way? And so I want to get into that a little bit and just kind of a checkup on Bitcoin and remind people what Bitcoin is in the beginning, and then we'll dive into that. But I also want to talk about just freedom in general and this fiat system and what it really is. And sometimes the truth hurts, right? And you can stick your head in the sand. And Phil Stutz has a really cool way of saying it, is like, he calls it the X. And it's like this negative thinking that we just kind of think, oh, that's okay, that's negative, that's just, I deserve that, I'm entitled to that. And we don't think about like really freedom or how do we deal with that X or that negative thinking, right? Or that or these negative realities of our world, right? And the Bible says life is hard, life is difficult. It's also one of the noble truths of it's the Zen Four Noble Truths. So I mean, it doesn't matter I guess it does matter if you believe in God, but even if you say, hey, I'm an agnostic, then pick anything. Life is difficult, but it's what we do with it, and like understanding the truth is what makes it manageable. So let's talk about Bitcoin just in general. I'm sure you've got this down, but I don't know if it's 30 seconds, 2 minutes, take whatever you are and explain to people what Bitcoin is. I'm going to act like somebody in the audience doesn't know.
Okay, yeah. Let's start at what Bitcoin is. The way I describe it is it's decentralized digital scarcity. And all those words mean something. Money needs to be scarce. If it's not scarce, then it ends up not being very useful, and that's one of the reasons why gold and silver have historically been money, because they're relatively scarce. So, for example, gold has increased in supply at a rate of around 1 or 2% for most of its history. There were parts of history when it was not, but gold and silver have been money for that reason. Um, it's also the gold is also decentralized. If you own some property, you can dig for gold in your property, and if you find any, that's yours to keep, and you can sell it and do something with it, whatever you want. Um, Centralized money is money that you're not allowed to go and make. If I'm printing U.S. dollars in my backyard, the Secret Service will come and arrest me. So there's a difference between centralized and decentralized money. There's also a difference between digital and physical money. So the U.S. dollar versus gold, for example, gold is physical. It's an actual commodity, and you have to physically transport it if you're giving it to somebody. Um, Digital money exists. Something like 96% of U.S. dollars are actually just like numbers on a ledger. It's not physical currency, and stuff like credit cards and PayPal and things like that. Those are all digital. You don't have to. Actually physically transport stuff to transfer value. So all those things mean something. The decentralized digital money, and up until 2009, you either had digital decentralized physical money or centralized digital money. Right, like you either have something like the U.S. dollar, which is centralized digital money, or you have something like gold, which is decentralized physical money. And the innovation of Bitcoin was decentralized digital money. You get the benefits of decentralization and digitization at the same time in this one thing. And it wasn't something that a lot of computer scientists thought was possible until Satoshi essentially proved it by releasing Bitcoin into the world. But it is something genuinely new, because it is both decentralized, as in anyone can try to go and mine Bitcoin, for example. But it's also digital in the sense that it doesn't require physical transport like gold does. So it's fair, apolitical money with all of the convenience of it being digital. And that's how I would describe Bitcoin.
Very cool. Okay. So now let's talk about fiat money and some of the problems with fiat money, what we've seen in the past, what you see coming in the future, and just why. And because I think if you do that, Jimmy, then that'll explain to people the need for Bitcoin.
Yeah, and it's hard to think about all of the ways in which fiat money affects us, because it's basically the water we're swimming in. But I'll just sort of like throw out a few sort of stats at you, and just sort of to think about what's happened, for example, since 1971. 1971 was when Nixon cut the ties of the dollar to gold permanently. It really started with FDR in 1933 with Executive Order 6102, which was shortly after he came into office, to essentially make it illegal for Americans to hold gold. Instead, they had to hold dollars, which were sort of connected to gold, but for other central banks, they could redeem dollars for gold. But Nixon finally cut that in 1971. This is called the Nixon shock. And it was August of 1971, a little over 50 years ago. But since then, if you just sort of look at any normal chart, you can see, for example, that with healthcare, for example, the number of doctors and nurses, the people that actually perform healthcare, has grown a little bit, right? Which you would expect just because of population increase and so on. But if you look at the number of administrators in healthcare, it's growing up like it's gone up like 1,000% or something like that. The number of administrators have gone up significantly, and it's not just healthcare. You can go look at college education. The number of professors and People that actually teach, for example, has gone up very small. But you look at the number of administrators, and they've gone up like crazy. You can look at the military. The number of actual soldiers, it's actually like gone up a little bit or gone down, but the number of administrators gone up tremendously. You look at almost anything, it ends up being something like that, where you have a lot of administrators, a lot of overhead, a lot of essentially just like bureaucratic cancer, right? That grows around it. And you could even look at corporations. A lot of it, HR departments have grown like gangbusters in almost every company for that reason. It brings in sort of like this um, uh, administrative class that isn't really providing value into the economy, and they proliferate under fiat money. Now, why, you might be asking at this point, all right, I see all of those things and I agree with all those things, but how's that related to fiat money? Well, the reason why those things happen is because there is a money printer. There's somebody that can essentially create money out of nothing. Now, they're done in the current system that we have today, which is essentially a central bank backed fiat money, through the creation of loans. And you can see this in almost all of these organizations and so on. The federal government, for example, has been running deficits for a very long time. Now, previously, when they ran deficits, they would have to go out to the market and get a loan. So they had to go get a loan from people that actually held dollars already. So they had to get loans from essentially savers, and banks were sort of that intermediary, which took the money that people were saving and lent it out to somebody else. And for a long time they did that, but at a certain point they realized, okay, you know what? Like, if we can create these loans out of nothing, then it'd be a lot more convenient, and that's the creation of the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And this is how it works today, where if the government has a budget of 6 trillion and has tax revenues of 4 trillion, the extra 2 trillion comes through treasuries. Some of that is sold into the market, but the vast majority gets bought by the Federal Reserve, in which case that's just money created out of nothing. And that expansion of money means that no one has to make any hard choices, and that means that instead of cutting useless departments, like say the Department of Energy or something like that, you just keep everything around and keep everyone happy. But ultimately, what that does is it steals from everybody else. And this is not just true at the federal level, at the company level, university level, at every level. Everything is being essentially subsidized by loans of some kind. So you look at, for example, the housing market. Anybody that knows anything about real estate knows that, like, the last 4 years, real estate everywhere has gone up tremendously. Well, why is that? Well, there's loans created out of nothing that are available for anyone that is trying to buy a house. The mortgage that you get, if you're buying $1 million house and you're paying 200,000 down, where does the $800,000 come from? Well, I can tell you where it doesn't come from. It's not from somebody's savings. There's not somebody on the other end going, you know what? I have $800,000. I want to put it into the bank at 0% or like 2% interest or whatever savings rate you're getting at your bank. And like no investor would do that. But the bank just creates $800,000 on your behalf when you're buying $1 million house, and that money comes into your account. It expands the supply of money in the economy, and this is essentially what's caused all of these real estate prices to go up like crazy. So ultimately, what happens is you get a static economy, an economy that is focused on making sure that the current players stay in power rather than innovation and entrepreneurship coming in. You get a lot of rent seekers, or people that aren't really adding anything but are collecting a salary or some rent from some position, usually around gatekeeping or permission giving. And that's essentially the economy that we have today. And I'm skipping over a lot of details, but they're in my book, Fiat Ruins Everything. Literally, like, at every level, from the individual to the corporate to the nation state to the global level, all of those levels are affected deeply by fiat money, and it's hard to know the depth of it until you really dive in, and you'll quickly realize that it's pretty bad.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because again, it's kind of like the truth. Um, it's like, okay, how much detail do you want of the truth? You know, like how much proof do you want? Do you want like, you know, okay, do you accept what I'm saying in my explanation? Like you said, a brief explanation, which I understand it's like hard to regulate. Like, how much do I give you? But like, if you can accept that truth, right? And even if you need to do some research, read your book, right? Go into the details and get the facts based. But it's even like books back to, the Creature of Jekyll Island. And I remember the YouTube, and people would say, "Man, that guy seems crazy." I'm like, well, okay, maybe he is crazy, but what he's saying is the truth, right? I mean, this is so when people think about this, then they say, wow, sounds like the dollar is going to fail. Sounds like fiat money is going to fail. Is it going to fail?
It will eventually. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is something like 27 years, which honestly isn't that much. Now, the dollar is the global reserve currency of the world. So all the other fiat currencies tend to be backstopped by the dollar in some way, shape, or form. And this is something that I point out in the book, is that US foreign policy is almost entirely based on the fact that it has the global reserve currency. Because if you are a country and you're going, you need some dollar reserve in order to defend the peg to your currency. So for any economy, if your exchange rate with the dollar gets too high, then imports are too expensive, and if it gets too low, then your exports are too expensive. So you have to sort of like manage this, and this is what every central bank does. But in order to make sure that you keep it in that range, you need a reserve of dollars. And unfortunately, a lot of these central banks run out of dollars at a certain point to buy back their currency. And this is where U.S. foreign policy kind of gets crazy. The U.S. will give swap lines to these struggling central banks, but it's done in a way as to ensure their compliance, because every country knows, well, if we don't go along with the U.S. on, Ukraine, for example, then next time we need a bailout, essentially, they're not going to give it to us, and that's a pretty big sort of like you know thing that they hold over their heads, is that, okay, like, we could destroy your economy, when you really need it. So you better come along with us. And you'll notice that the hyperinflating economies, the fiat currencies that fail, tend to be from places where the leader has essentially pissed off the United States. So Venezuela is an obvious one, but even more recently, Lebanon, Turkey, even Nigeria to some degree. These are places where they're not that friendly with the U.S., especially with respect to foreign policy. And that tends to be the case, is that the U.S. uses the monetary lever to get compliance from everybody else. So all that is to say that the U.S. dollar is sort of a special currency in the current regime, but that's starting to crumble, as we're seeing with the BRICS alliance and so on. Russia, for example, is completely cut off from the dollar. So they're starting to settle in other currencies with China, their biggest trading partner. They're trying to settle in the yuan or the ruble a little bit, and they have other members of the alliance. There's talk about creating their own alliance and creating their own currency within that alliance and so on. But that's sort of how the whole thing works. And what we're seeing with the dollar is that it's starting to lose its global reserve status. And what's even more remarkable is that it's been based on oil for the last 50 years or so. Since 1973 or so, the dollar has more or less been backed by oil. It's called the petrodollar for that reason. All global settlement of oil trade must be done in the dollar. and that's starting to crumble a little bit. Saudi Arabia is now a part of the BRICS alliance, and they're sort of willing to settle that. And this is not a small thing. This is major to have other currencies available to buy oil, because that means that you don't have to keep a dollar reserve, and that means that at some point the dollar may not be the global reserve currency. In which case, I think the dollar would crumble much faster, because the U.S. is basically has no industrial base left. And this is one of those things that is not obvious, but once you think about it, is which is that when you have the global reserve currency, you basically lose your entire industrial base. And that's essentially what's happened since 1971, is that all manufacturing has moved out of the United States, at first to like Korea and Japan, then further east to, China, and now in like Malaysia and Vietnam and Indonesia and places like that. Now, why is that happening? Well, Richard Cantillon wrote about this way back in 1723, when he noticed this about the Bank of England, when the British pound was the world reserve currency, that your industrial base will be destroyed because labor is going to be cheaper in other places as a result of the fact that you have the global reserve currency. The money printed means that it's going to be much more expensive to buy labor in the home country. It's much cheaper in other places, and that's essentially what's happened. All manufacturing is gone, and this is ultimately what causes the global reserve currency to fail. Because once you lose your industrial base, well, what do you have? You just have sort of like financial gains and so on. And this is why places like London and New York are known for their financial infrastructure, but that's it. They don't make anything, right? Like they don't create cars or trucks or planes or sewing machines or whatever. All of that is now done elsewhere. And that gives those places power and gives them leverage, which means that ultimately the dollar will, it will be doomed. But I mean, this game can go on much longer than you think. And this is the sort of like weirdness that we're in, is that we're in this stage where manufacturing has left. U.S. power is kind of declining. It's somewhat based on the military, but where do the chips for all of the vehicles and things come from? Well, they right now come from Taiwan with TSMC, and the global supply chain is extremely fragile because of fiat money and so on. So ultimately, it will die. It's just a matter of time. But exactly how that happens, it's hard to say.
And do you think like with other currencies, like when the dollar dies, it'll be reset and in hours or days, or like what do you see? Like what will that look like?
Yeah, so if you study hyperinflation a little bit, and I had the privilege of going to Lebanon about a year and a half ago, and the thing that you notice first of all is that there's no credit at all. So you try to go and use Uber in Lebanon, for example, and you have to pay in cash. Well, why is that? Well, if you pay in credit card, the way credit cards work is that they settle 30 to 45 days after you actually pay for the item. And for anyone in Lebanon, waiting 30 to 45 days to get paid in Lebanese pounds would be suicide, because it's hyperinflating so fast.
Right.
Just to give you an idea, when I was in Lebanon for only a week. The day I arrived, it was 44,000 Lebanese pounds to a dollar. The day I left, it was 49,000. So there was about 10% inflation in just a week. I think it's somewhere around 100,000 at the moment, or something like that. So it's very quick. So for them to wait 30 to 45 days is stupid. There would be no way to do it. So there's no real credit available, because everyone would take out as much loans as they can, because they'd be paying back in debased pounds later, which is a trade that anyone would love to take. So, you can't get a mortgage, obviously, because if you got a mortgage and paid for a house, for example, then the person with the pounds would get, first of all, have to spend it as quickly as possible. But the bank is not going to give you that loan because it's debasing so quickly. So there's no credit available. So everything is done in cash. And for the most part, people just take dollars, right? The dollar becomes the backstop. So you go to a restaurant and you pay for a meal, like say it's $50 or something. And the largest Lebanese note is 100,000 Lebanese pounds, and at the time that was worth about $2. So you have to have like these large stacks of bills to pay for anything. So every store has these like bill counting machines because they don't want to sit there and count 25 or whatever or 100 or of these bills. So so they'll just take dollars. So you pay $50 with U.S. bill, and they give you change in Lebanese pounds, and that's just how it becomes. Is that there's a when there's a better currency, people want the better currency, and the U.S. dollar is clearly better than the Lebanese pound, and I expect that sort of dynamic to happen as the dollar goes down. Now, even now, a lot of people realize that there's a lot of inflation going on. And this is why real estate, part of the reason why real estate is so popular is that it stores value way better than the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So if you hold a home, then you're going to do better. Similar thing with stocks. If you hold a stock, it'll do better than the dollar will because it's inflating so quickly. So that causes asset inflation, and that means that the people that actually need the homes don't get them. It becomes sort of like this investment vehicle instead, and that's definitely happened in Lebanon. One of my friends that was there was regretting not getting a large mortgage and buying property in Lebanon because essentially anyone that bought on debt like five years ago, they're paying like $2 a month for their mortgage, and the bank did all of these things to try to like get around it. So in 2021, for example, or 2020 or so, a lot of banks like offered like just a straight up 30% a decrease in principal for your loan if you would switch from Lebanese pound denominated loan to a dollar denominated loan. And some people took that, and of course they now regret it because they owe so much more. And they could pay it off because it's so little, but they're like, you know what, I'm just gonna keep it because it's only like $1, and it's like $2 today, but in a year it'll be like $1. It's kind of getting ridiculous that way. So that sort of dynamic is what you should expect in a hyperinflationary scenario. But instead of the dollar backstop, I think you have something like a gold or a Bitcoin backstop, and that's where we're headed.
I love that. Jimmy, when I at the beginning I said you have a great way of saying, and maybe it's in the book. Actually, I think it's in the book, but I think maybe you said it on the show too. Say what you say about exchanging time for money, and then the government debasing the money, and how that is the very definition of slavery. Say it the way you say it.
I think you just said it. So I don't think I need to say it. But basically,
okay.
The way to think about money is it's sort of like a battery for your time, right? Like you exchange time for money. That's labor. But if the government is taking your money, then they're really taking your time. And that's really the definition of slavery. And that's unfortunately the situation that we're all in, is that because, the money printer, the central bank controls the money, the denominator in this case of that equation, then they essentially control your labor, and they have slavery or mastery over you.
So, Jimmy, when people say, everybody sees Bitcoin kind of like you talked about stocks, right? They see it as like an instrument. And one of the reasons that like stocks, in my opinion, there's a problem with stocks because they're fiat based, right? I mean, you're holding an instrument that's going down in value every second of every day, even before you get a return or a loss, right? And so when you own an asset, like you mentioned real estate, so let's just use that, is the assets going up in value as they print more and more money, right? And so, theoretically, I'm not saying have all real estate or all businesses, but if I have a business or I have real estate, and the government keeps printing money, I can raise my rents as the government raises or debases my money, and I can keep up to some degree. With Bitcoin, it's so different because but I think the problem as Bitcoin's kind of getting not this footing, but kind of as it's growing and the governments are really figuring out, how do I use it, right? And how does Bitcoin solve problems for governments like El Salvador and other countries like that um where are we with Bitcoin in 5 years? And I'm not saying like, what will it be worth? What's a Bitcoin going to be worth? Because I know I'm not asking you to speculate that. What I'm asking is how will we be using Bitcoin differently than we're using it today?
Yeah, the main so let's go back to El Salvador, because that's a very interesting case. And that this is a country that's been basically in financial hell for a long time, and it's only recently that it's gotten out of it. But the way that a lot of developing countries work is that they get IMF loans and World Bank loans, and that's how they sort of sustain themselves. But if you get those loans, they come with a lot of strings attached, largely on the budget that you have to have. So, for example, in El Salvador, when they took IMF loans, one of the conditions of that loan was that your national budget can only spend at most 8% on infrastructure. Now, think about a developing country. The reason why we call them developing countries is because they need to develop infrastructure, right? So for them, developing roads and sewer systems and things like that are absolutely critical to getting their economy good. But the IMF basically says you have to keep it at 8%. Now, why is the IMF saying that? Well, because they want certain things to be produced in these countries so that they have a continual dependence. So a lot of the IMF policies are designed to get raw materials for processing in the developed countries. So, for example, palm oil, coffee, cocoa, things like that, which are like require a lot of land and a lot of labor, but isn't economical or it doesn't make sense to do in the United States or wherever. They always like put into these countries, and if they develop too much, then it no longer becomes economical in those countries as well. So then they don't have a supply of these things. So the IMF and World Bank regime essentially keep these developing countries developing, right? Like they don't let them actually develop, make energy, for example, very difficult, and demand that they go green or something like that. But ultimately, that's the shackles that they put on these, and I call it like monetary imperialism. It's all the benefits of imperialism without any of the bloodshed. It's kind of great for all the first world countries because they get to enslave these countries without doing it. Now, what El Salvador has done is basically say they've adopted more of a Bitcoin standard by essentially saying no to the IMF. They're saying we will pay back the loans that we have with you, but we are no longer going to take any more loans. And instead, we're going to operate on a Bitcoin standard. So they are no longer bound by the IMF, policies and so on. So they are pouring a lot of money into infrastructure. I've been there 4 times in the last 3 years, and each time I go back, you can kind of see it in the streets. Everything is getting cleaned up. There's like more roads. There's more sewers. There's more electricity, things like that. And this is what real development looks like, and this is what sort of Bitcoin enables. It's instead of sort of the rent-seeking class, like sort of keeping things the same, you get innovation, you get entrepreneurship, you get more people that are able to, actually provide goods and services to the market and so on. So, the way Bitcoin is used in that economy is as a way of funding a lot of stuff, but ultimately it's getting rid of fiat, right? It's allowing them to it constrains the government significantly because they can't deficit spend. It means that businesses aren't getting sort of like very cheap loans to sustain sort of zombie companies and so on. It means that there's more innovation, more activity, more new stuff coming on, and that's the dynamism that you see when you're sort of away from fiat money. And that's what I expect to see in about 5 years, is more of that happening all over the world. And instead of like all the money going to the administrative class, the rent seekers and people like that, it goes towards the entrepreneurs and the innovators and the people that are actually making things. And that's, I think, ultimately where you want to be as an economy, because if you fund the rent seekers and so on too much, essentially you have a dying civilization. This is what happened to Rome, for example. They kept debasing their currency, kept funding sort of like the corrupt aristocratic class and so on, instead of allowing innovation to happen.
Yeah, no, that's, this is every time like I ask you a question, you give me an answer, I could probably ask you 10 other questions. So, but I think that maybe we wrap it up right there. I appreciate your time. And I'm going to put in I bought the book while we were talking, by the way. So I'm ADHD. So if I don't do it now, and in a couple of days, I'll forget that I ordered it, and it'll show up, and I'll say, "Oh, cool." So I ordered it while we were doing this interview, because I love this subject, and I love trying to do things differently. And obviously, you started at a young age, and you've had a lot of success, and I'm getting into Bitcoin when you did. And obviously that's been a really an amazing, when people think about building wealth. It's funny, people asked me the other day, like people in the last week, I don't know if you ever get this to happen to you, Jimmy, but where there's like 2 or 3 people have asked me the same question, like, who's the wealthiest person that you know? And I think, and the person that I said was Nelson Nash. And I didn't say it because of his bank account, but he was so wealthy in his 80s because he was still doing what he loved, and he had plenty of money, and he was just like the wealthiest guy. He loved his church, like, and his family, and he had just so many friends and people that admired him. And I say, I think I have 3 business partners that are billionaires, and I would still say he's the wealthiest guy that I know. And he wasn't a billionaire, but along your way, everybody's had to give you some good advice. What's the best advice you've ever received?
It's not exactly advice, but it was sort of like an adage. It's as you get older, you just sort of care about fewer things, and I think that's been true. And the more things I cut out of my life, the better it's been.
Yeah.
And I used to love like watching NFL football, for example, and my wife would just like lose me on Sundays, and just okay, I'm gonna watch my 4 games, the 1 o'clock, the 4 o'clock, and the Sunday night game, and then the Monday night game or something, and then you had college football, and it's like the whole weekend's gone. Cutting that out of my life actually was a very good thing, right? Like I'm able to focus much more on my family, and there are good things. Football's not bad unless you're like gambling on it or something, but there are better things. And if you cut out some of the things that you enjoy, sometimes it can be better. And focusing on fewer things, I think in general is better.
I love that. I think too, as you get older, you fear less things, that like, you just, it's like, okay, like,
I don't care what other people think. It's just, like you, and that's something that I think, a lot of young people could use is because, especially with social media and stuff, they care way too much about what other people think. But at a certain point, you just sort of like give that up too, and it frees you to kind of pursue whatever you want. And yeah, they might judge you. That's okay. And let them live their. Most of the time, they're not thinking about you anyway. So. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that you're exactly right. Okay. Last question, Jimmy. If God came down from heaven today and only allowed you to retain the knowledge that you've received from one book that's not the Bible, what would that book be?
I guess it would have to be something long and comprehensive. So I'm gonna go with Summa Theologica, even though I haven't read all of it. But I know it has a lot of good information, and at least the parts that I have read are very insightful. So I go with that.
I love it. I love it. I haven't read that either, but and the way that you describe it is, if you haven't read it all, like it's kind of funny. I just started a new Phil Stutz book, and I really like him. I think he's cool, and I think he's to your point. He's gotten to that point in at his age, and he has Parkinson's and everything. He's just like, he doesn't really care what you think. He doesn't care when he exposes like psychiatry and it just doesn't work. This, and taking these meds and everything else. He doesn't care what you think. If he was 25, he'd think, oh, they might ruin my career. They might do this. They might do that. And I love that freedom. My doctor is 77 years old, and he has that same freedom. He's like, yeah, I don't care.
This is one of the things of like to just kind of bring it back to fiat money.
Yeah.
This the thing about like fiat money is that you do have this sort of like existential political risk almost constantly, and that's not normal. Like this sort of like I don't care what you think attitude is what built America. It's why I wear the hat. It's people just sort of went out there and said, can you imagine like a cowboy in the 1800s like being canceled? You can't cancel a cowboy,
right?
That doesn't happen, right? Yeah. Like they don't care, right? And that was part of that ethic. It's really only with the advent of fiat money and all the rent seeking and they might like take away my job or my benefits or sue me or whatever. And that fear needs to go. It's not a natural state of things.
Yeah, no, I love that. Okay, so the new book is Fiat Ruins Everything: How Our Financial System is Rigged and How Bitcoin Fixes It. There's all kinds you can get it Kindle, Audible, or audiobook, paperback. I got the paperback. I like to listen and read at the same time. So, Jimmy, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and sharing your thoughts and just serving people and trying to educate people. Because the more that you know, again, I'll bring this back to Nelson Nash. He'd say, what did he catch? Now I just lost the quote. He'd say, well, one, I'll end it with the one that I do remember. The one left my head there, but he'd say the majority's never been right about anything. And you have to educate yourself so that you have the confidence to go against the majority. So with that, Jimmy, we're going to end this like we do every other episode with the great words of Earl Nightingale and the Strangest Secret. Take it away, Earl.
Here's the key to success and the key to failure. We become what we think about. Now let me say that again. We become what we think about.
Thanks for listening to the Breakaway Wealth Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to this show wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. If you want to start increasing your wealth building ability right now, go to community.createtailwind.com to join our free online community and get access to free, in-depth training designed to help you build real, lasting wealth. See you next week.